When Charles returned to the survival base, everyone had been anticipating his return, and they gathered around to hear what had happened at Stellar Technologies' secret base. Lena saw that Charles was covered in blood, and the sight made her so nervous that she almost cried. "Charles, we're safe in here," she cried. "Why would you risk leaving?" Charles gave her a comforting hug. "Don't worry," he said gently. "None of this is my blood." He had returned to the base in the dark, and darkness attracted nocturnal monsters that weren't an issue during the day. Nighttime was also when the zombies increased their activity, so Charles had encountered many monsters on his way home. He could have used his speed to avoid most of them, but he had been glad for the chance to fight. He had even walked up to a group of monsters and had challenged them directly. Charles had been slightly depressed after the events in the lab, and when he felt low, he relied on fighting to alleviate his bad mood and cheer him up. Alice waved her hand, and a ball of blue water vapor swept across Charles's body. She cleaned all the blood and patted his chest. "Wow," she said. "You were right. None of that blood was yours at all." Usually, returning to Alice after a dangerous mission made his heart skip a beat, but he didn't have the same fluttering feeling in his stomach that he usually did. Miranda noticed there was something wrong with him. "Did something happen?" she asked. "What did you find at Stellar Technologies' base?" Charles was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Raise all the energy shields and prepare to defend the base. I'm expecting Stellar Technology to launch an attack any minute now." "Why?" Olivia asked. "Were there a lot more trained troops at their base?" Charles shook his head. "No, I pretty much destroyed their base and underground laboratory. All of their guards should be dead by now, but I'm worried that because of that, they'll want retribution." "You destroyed their base?" Olivia asked incredulously. She was completely taken aback. "I thought he just went to assess the situation," she thought. "Why has he been gone for a whole day? And why did he kill so many of them? Surely he would have said something if he intended to launch an attack on them." The others thought it was some kind of joke, until they saw that he was deadly serious. They also knew that whether or not he had done the right thing, a defense still had to be arranged. Charles helped his team make the necessary arrangements. He felt slightly guilty about bringing more danger to their door, but he was afraid to recount everything that had happened at the base, because he didn't want the information to be public knowledge. Instead, he called a meeting of his most loyal followers. Only then did he mention Experiment 3 and the little girl he had brought back. When Charles took the little girl out of the energy storage space, Olivia was slightly surprised to learn that the space could support life, but she knew that it wasn't the time to discuss the matter. When Charles told them all what had happened, it deepened everyone's hatred for Stellar Technology. They had initially disliked the company because of the threat it posed to them, and how often its employees attacked the Alliance. But now it seemed as though Stellar Technology represented everything that was wrong with the world. No one with a conscience or a heart could hear the atrocities the company had committed and not be appalled. While they all stood around and discussed what should happen next, Elena appeared. She was covered from head to toe in blood, presumably from her latest conquest. Everyone was familiar with her. She was one of Charles's most ruthless fighters, and the person who stood by his side the most on the battlefield. She hadn't been with the Alliance long, but she seemed entirely devoted to the cause, and she immersed herself in the fight more than anyone else in the team. She didn't know when to quit, and she only retreated when she was exhausted or covered in so many injuries she could no longer fight. Then she would give Charles her spoils, and often exchange them for weapons that would enable her to kill more monsters during her next battle. She never asked for anything other than equipment or the means to increase her strength. It seemed she couldn't get enough power. No one was surprised by her sudden appearance. They looked at her expectantly and waited for her to address Charles before they started their discussion. Elena was known to dislike being part of group discussions, and she often excused herself from them. Although she had deep respect for Charles and a love of personal power, she never asked him to grant her any power over others. The only thing she was interested in was building her individual strength. "Charles," she said, "I want to exchange." But when she extended her hand to offer Charles her backpack, she suddenly stopped and looked at the little girl in his arms. The bag fell to the ground, forgotten. "What's wrong?" Hugh asked curiously. They all looked in astonishment as tears started to stream down Elena's cheeks, and their mouths fell open in shock. Their most fearless and terrifying warrior never complained about anything, let alone burst into tears. "Jenny?" Elena whispered. Charles felt goosebumps on his arms. Then he looked at the little girl in his arms and examined her features more closely. Now that Elena was right in front of him, he could see there was a strong resemblance between the two. "Jenny!" Elena cried. "Mommy's here." Oblivious to the bewildered stares of her colleagues, Elena raced to Charles and reached a shaking hand toward the little girl. However, when she remembered that she was soaked with blood from her battle, she hesitated and decided not to embrace the child for fear that she would wake up and be afraid. Tina sighed and said quietly to Olivia, "What are the odds of these two being reunited? I never thought I'd see something so amazing. I always wonder what it was that drove Elena to fight the way she did every day. Well, now we know. Since her daughter was alive the whole time, I feel a little guilty for letting her go so hard on the battlefield." Olivia shook her head. "No. If Elena hadn't increased her strength by any means necessary to try and get her revenge, she wouldn't have fought so hard for the Alliance in the first place. That anger is probably what's kept her alive." Not one person who saw the reunion of the mother and daughter dared to break the silence or detract from the moment. They all felt a wave of emotion in their hearts. The thought of a mother working so hard to try and avenge her daughter touched them all, and there was a tinge of tragedy in the fact that she couldn't hold her daughter after so long because she was so bloodied from trying to avenge her. Suddenly, Charles softly said to everyone, "Could you all give me a while with Elena? I have something to say to her." Everyone left the meeting room in silence. Although they didn't know what Charles could possibly have to say, if he wanted to keep it a secret, he obviously had his reasons. Once everyone had gone, Charles used a silencing amulet to form a soundproof barrier around the three of them. Then he carefully placed Jenny on a nearby table. He said to Elena, "Your daughter is fine now. She should be able to wake up in a few hours." Elena looked at him with hopeful eyes. "Really?" she asked tearfully. The other reason Elena hadn't embraced her daughter was because of the girl's comatose state. She was afraid that if she touched her, it might restore hope in her heart, and if her little girl passed away after, she was terrified that she would never recover from the despair. But when Charles told her that her child would live, she was filled with joy. "Jenny's father entrusted her to me before he died," Charles said sadly. "I'm sorry that I couldn't save him." Elena looked confused. "Her father?" she asked. "Jenny's father died in a car accident a few years ago. We had him cremated." Charles was stunned. So the person who tried to protect her wasn't her father? He had assumed Experiment 3's motivation to save her had been a father's love for his daughter, and he wondered what could possibly possess the creature to practically beg Charles to save a stranger. Elena looked at Jenny. "Whoever he was," she said, "he saved my baby." Elena explained that Jenny was a low-level paranormal, but her abilities seemed a little different from everyone else's. She'd been quickly discovered and targeted by the people who ran Stellar Technology. They had initially used her as a test subject before they had apparently discovered something extraordinary about her. Elena had wanted to save her daughter, but she had been powerless at the time. Her attempts to take Jenny and escape the base had angered the more powerful members, and eventually, Elena had been tipped off that they had planned to assassinate her. The same man who had warned her of the plot had managed to help Elena escape. He had promised her he would do all he could to keep Jenny safe and get her back to her mother. Although Elena had been terrified at the prospect of leaving her daughter in such an awful place, she'd hoped to become strong enough to save her. "So finally," Elena said, concluding the tale of her past, "I was forced to separate from my daughter and escape. In the end, the military found me when I was at my lowest point. They rescued me and took me into the fortress." The man who had saved Elena was presumably Experiment 3, and she considered him her daughter's guardian angel. She knew that blood relations had a strong bond, and shared ancestry forged familial ties and feelings of kinship. But relationships didn't require blood to be powerful. Sometimes the bonds people created for themselves were stronger than those created for them by birth. "I asked everyone else to leave," Charles explained, "because I have something very important to tell you. I didn't want you to be put on the spot. Elena's heart skipped a beat. What is it? She asked. She knew whatever he wanted to say wasn't an ordinary matter. Charles didn't keep anything from his most loyal colleagues. Elena had seen how he operated as a leader, and he trusted the other Alliance leaders implicitly. Charles looked at Jenny. There's a very unusual power in her body, he told Elena. It isn't strong yet, but it's there. Her power seems to be an amalgamation of the powers of the zombies and the mutated creatures. I've never seen anything like it before. Of course, Jenny's power was recorded in the ancient book, but Charles kept the book's existence secret from everyone. Elena was anxious when she heard the news. What'll it do to her? She asked nervously. It won't cause any harm to her body, Charles assured her. But at the same time, it's the source of all her misfortune. I think the people at Stellar Technology are using her power to increase their own. As soon as they realize she's gone, they'll be furious. Elena's heart sank. Why can't those awful people from that terrible place let her go? She thought. But despite the threat of imminent danger, she looked at her daughter with determination. I didn't have the power to protect her in the past, she said, but I do now. That may be, Charles said, but you know better than I how powerful Stellar Technology is. You don't think you can fight this on your own, do you? Elena's eyes watered again. If the threat of having her here is too much, I can take her away, she said. Although she hadn't been part of the Alliance for very long, Elena felt a sense of belonging there. She'd always known that Charles was using her for her skills, and she'd been willing to let him, since it kept her distracted from not having her daughter. But she knew Charles was self-serving, and if he didn't want to risk the others' lives for Jenny, Elena knew she had to accept that. Stellar Technology had immense power, and it was reasonable that Charles didn't want to fight them any more than was absolutely necessary. You can't be serious, Charles said. If Jenny falls into the enemy's hands, the consequences will be even worse. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Even if she hadn't been your daughter, I wouldn't have let those assholes take her away again, he assured her. I won't hear of you trying to keep her alive out there on your own. Seeing such conviction in a man famous for his coldness moved Elena almost to tears again. She couldn't find any words to express her gratitude. Thank you, she finally managed. It's all right, he said. Then he added, I can help you increase your strength as much as possible so that you have the power to protect your daughter. But you have to promise me one thing. Whatever it is, I agree, she said confidently. Charles knew he was about to ask the impossible, but he also knew the importance of his request. Jenny's existence is a huge threat to not only the world, but to herself, he said. I'll risk my life to protect her, but if she's discovered by Stellar Technology, or someone even stronger than them, and something happens to me, you need to do whatever it takes to prevent her from falling into the wrong hands. Absolutely, Elena agreed. I understand. I won't let anyone take her, no matter what price I have to pay. Charles sighed and said, No, you don't understand. What I mean is that, at all costs, she can't fall into the wrong hands. I don't mean just your life, but something more important. Something more important, she wondered, mystified. She didn't understand at first, but in an instant, her face turned pale. There was only one thing more important than her life. I couldn't, she cried. Charles walked to the window and rubbed his forehead. He knew that if Stellar Technology had access to Jenny, they would be able to use her to create untold misery. For the Alliance, it would be a disaster. How could I follow through with it? Elena asked him. Charles knew that Jenny inadvertently posed a threat to humanity. Logically, he knew her continued existence was a danger to them all, but he couldn't bring himself to think about harming her. She was an innocent little girl, and even though he knew he had lost most of his humanity, the only reason he had continued to fight throughout the darkest years of his life was because of the support he had received from others. If he lost the most fundamental part of himself, then he was no better than Stellar Technology, or the zombies that threatened his world. Charles thought how much better it would have been if he hadn't seen little Jenny in the cage in the laboratory. But what was done was done. Elena walked over to her sleeping daughter and touched her arm gently. Then she approached Charles. When she spoke, her tone had returned to normal. I understand, she said. Jenny is a kind child. She would never want to hurt anyone. So if we really can't protect her, if there's absolutely no way to save her, I'll do whatever it takes. I won't let them take her again." Behind her stoic appearance, Charles would never know how much pain it caused Elena to say those words. However, she also understood that it was the best choice for Jenny. If Jenny was taken back to the laboratory and became a tool for those at Stellar Technology, whatever fate they had in store for her would be crueler than death. Charles wanted to say something sincere, but when he opened his mouth, he couldn't find the words he wanted. Instead, he made Elena a promise. "I won't let it come to that." Charles and Elena talked together for so long that it made the others in the Alliance start to worry. Even when they had been threatened by the swarm of insects, they had never seen Charles have such a long meeting. Once the two of them eventually emerged from the room, the sleeping Jenny now in Elena's arms, Charles put an end to the murmurs and told everyone to return to their rooms. Then he arranged a room in the watchtower for Elena and Jenny and set up a defensive barrier, which was a simplified version of the energy shield. Alice felt a slight twinge of jealousy, but she dismissed it. She didn't doubt Charles's loyalty. It seemed to her that there must have been something very important he had wanted to discuss. It wasn't her place to pry. Charles's residence was a 12-story building known as the Watchtower, because it was a tall building that doubled as a watchtower. The 6 bottom floors contained offices and shared accommodation for his most trusted followers. And Charles and Lena lived on the 6 floors above. Only he and his most trusted allies were permitted to enter. Despite the watchtower's size, there was still room to expand and increase its height. Charles's decision to position his residence at the entrance of Survival Base as a first layer of defense against external enemies had been met with cheers of approval by the Dawn Alliance's members. In their minds, it appeared that Charles was willing to risk his life by positioning himself closer to danger than anyone else. This opinion had spread throughout the Alliance, and it boosted everyone's admiration and loyalty. Although most of them were shrewd enough to know that Charles was a notorious user and needed followers to ensure its own survival, that was less important than knowing that the second there was danger, their leader would be the first one to protect them. During such a dark and dangerous time, there was nothing more important than that. Of course, the real reason Charles had ensured his residence was positioned where it wasn't nearly as altruistic as his followers imagined. Most people assumed that because they were in a survival base, the center of the compound was the safest place to be. It made sense that the outermost areas were the most dangerous. But that wasn't the case. A person's survival didn't depend on how many people stood between them and danger, but the speed at which the danger was discovered. The first person to discover it had the most time to prepare, and the watchtower was the best place to observe danger. When Charles was home, he was the first to see anything approaching. And he knew that if he could see the enemy first, he could deal with it immediately. If whatever was approaching was too dangerous for him to deal with alone, he could then call the entire Alliance. If the Alliance couldn't deal with whatever the threat was, then he could organize an evacuation. An additional benefit was that if an enemy approached from a different direction and was strong enough to breach the base's perimeter, Charles could quickly arrange for people to defend the base, and then, since he was located near the exit, he could make a quick escape. If he lived in the center of the base, not only would he be the last person to know about an approaching attack, but he would be cut off from all the exit points. Charles's layout design came from his experience during his previous life. He knew of many people who had amassed a great deal of power and strength, but because their base had been taken, it had resulted in their deaths. In instances where bases had been caught unaware, it had also become common for trampling incidences to occur. Even though the leader had more strength than anyone else, they had been powerless when faced with a stampeding crowd. It had been much later in Charles's previous existence when he had realized that the stronger the expert was, the further away from the center of the base they should be. The 7th floor of the watchtower contained Lena and Sylvia's rooms. It was also where Charles set up Elena and Jenny. Miranda had absolutely refused to stay in the apartment. Charles had delegated a space on the 3rd floor as a dining room. In such a dangerous world, it was a rare joy to be able to eat at a table with family and friends. So he had set up a gathering place where his most trusted colleagues could dine together. The next morning, everyone arrived in the dining room for breakfast, but instead of their usual buffet, the table was laden with weapons. The objects were either red, blue, or purple, and they looked incredible. Although they were obviously designed for practicality, there was no doubt that Charles had put a lot of effort into their design. Elemental paranormals could use their control over the elements to craft weapons, but none of the assembled Alliance leaders had ever seen anything that compared to the ones before them. All the upper members of the Dawn Alliance were always grateful and delighted when Charles gave them weapons that he had personally refined. So, when they saw the gorgeous objects on the table, their faces lit up. Hugh, Tommy, and those who had followed Charles the longest all looked at the new weapons with barely contained glee, but they didn't dare ask Charles whether they could pick them up. Miranda rolled her eyes at everyone's bashfulness and asked what they were all thinking. "Are these for us?" "That's right," Charles said. "I wanted to forge a weapon for each of you, but we don't have enough time, and our enemy might show up at any moment. I was only able to forge a few, but please don't be discouraged. Everyone will get one as soon as I can find time to make them." Tina nodded. She knew that she wasn't going to get one of the latest tools, but she already had the insect fang dagger that Charles had given her previously, so she wasn't too disappointed. Charles handed a fiery red sword to Kevin. "I know you've always wanted a sword, but haven't found one that can handle your strength," he said. "This one should be able to withstand your power, but I haven't found a suitable material for the hilt yet. Keep an eye on it during the battle, and if it breaks, let me know and I'll change it." The red sword had been forged using Crimson Flame Energy gems. Charles had made 2 of them, one for Kevin and the other for Elena, because Elena was the one who was protecting Jenny. Kevin accepted the sword. "You're right," he said. "I think a good sword would improve my strength." Kevin had high expectations for the sword. No weapon that Charles had forged for him previously had been suitable for more than one battle. He knew that if Charles had selected him as one of the recipients of the new pieces of equipment, it was because he was confident in its abilities. Charles handed a purple longbow and a dozen arrows to Lena. "These are yours," he said. "I thought they would suit your strengths, detection, and range." Lena took the bow and arrows from Charles, and she couldn't help but admire them. She wasn't the kind of person who liked fighting. If possible, she would rather not kill anyone. Whenever she was faced with an unavoidable situation where she had to kill, she generally used her long-range abilities to fight. The weapon suited her perfectly. She knew that it was also important that Charles felt she was safe. If he was on a battlefield worrying whether his sister was all right, it would make him an ineffectual leader. She loved the fact that she had a weapon that ensured Charles could focus on his battles. Those who weren't paranormals looked at Lena with envy. They knew she was Charles's sister, but she had powers already. They thought he should have given a weapon to someone who needed it more, particularly when it was one that ensured the wielder was at a safe distance from the fight. "I'll show you how to use this later," Charles promised Lena. "Don't shoot these randomly. Every one of them is precious. I'll show you how to make your own ordinary arrows so you can use them most of the time." Lena nodded. She could tell how important it was to him, and of course, she wouldn't refuse such a beautiful gift. What she didn't know was that her bow and arrow had consumed most of Charles's attention. He had used the blue flame energy gems that he had taken from Stellar Technologies' mine. When he had combined them with the crimson flame energy gems, it had created an even more powerful weapon. The weapon had enough supplementary soul energy amplification to penetrate a level 3 bio-altered paranormal. Charles had designed the arrows specially and had reinforced them with a swirling wind array to give them additional accuracy, acceleration, and strength. The arrow shafts were a thing of beauty. There was a total of 12 specialist arrows, and Charles had carved each with an explosive flame amulet that had the power to kill a level 4 bio-altered paranormal from 9 feet away. If 7 of the arrows were fired at once, even a level 5 paranormal wouldn't be able to withstand the power. Of course, Charles had made the 12 arrows as a failsafe for Lena. They were only to be used in the direst circumstances. For everyday use, he would prepare ordinary arrows for her. Although he knew the bow and arrow would boost her confidence in battle, Charles had another reason to want Lena to learn archery. Even though there were other paranormals who had good aim and steady hands, he was determined for Lena to excel at it. If her primary strength was with a bow and arrow, then she didn't need to practice too many close combat skills. All she needed to do if her arrows failed her was run for her life, because she was already at an advantage by being further away. It enhanced her chance for her survival. Charles had resolved to teach her some evasive skills. This way, whatever situation she was in, whether alone or among a group, she would be prepared and confident. In Charles's world, nothing mattered more to him than his sister. Once he had set Lena up with her bow and arrows, he continued to distribute the remaining weapons. He passed 2 red arm guards to Zack. "You reached level 5, he said, "and although you can use True Fire, your skill with it is still developing. If you use it in battle, it's still not as useful as Hellfire. This arm guard can store True Fire. It'll help you retain around half of your energy." Charles knew the others would accuse him of favoritism for giving his strongest fighters the newest weapons, but he needed to maximize his force's combat strength. Other than himself, Zack and Alice were his highest level fighters. Zack's attack power was stronger than anyone else's, and he was an elemental paranormal. He was more powerful than a bio-altered paranormal, and with his armbands, he could almost double his strength. "Thank you," Zack said excitedly. Charles smiled. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "These arm guards can store flames and release them, but you don't have to wear them. They'll work from up to 50 feet away. If you want to, you can let someone else wear them." Zack looked at Harper. If there was anyone he was going to protect, it was her. She noticed his glance and shyly looked away. Everyone knew that Charles had created the armband's protective capabilities for her. It was common knowledge that fire paranormals lacked suitable defense, but that depended on who the paranormal was. Zack's True Fire could incinerate most other attacks. If Harper wore the armband, it meant her safety was all but guaranteed. Some of the others looked at her with a mixture of envy and irritation. "This is all very nice," Anthony said to Charles, "but I'd love it if you'd help out some of us who maybe don't already have more power than God." He said it in jest to relieve some of the tension that Charles's obvious favoritism had created. Miranda rolled her eyes at him. "You're no one to call him out when you have multiple women chasing you, and you decide not to choose any of them. If anyone has a God complex, it's you." "Please," Anthony joked. "They just like me for my body. You're not telling me any of them would be chasing me if I wasn't a paranormal." He was a level 4 paranormal, and there were a few women he had saved in the past who wanted to capture his affection, but he didn't like feeling as though he was taking advantage of them or using his powers to attract people who didn't like him for who he was. "Is it any different whether you rely on strength, money, looks, or other advantages to attract someone?" Charles asked. "Nobody likes a freeloader who can't do anything. People are attracted to the qualities they admire." Anthony hadn't thought of it like that before. "It's not wrong for them to want a strong man," Charles continued. "Everyone is good at something, and you're a powerful, funny guy. What does it matter whether they're attracted to you for your ability or your personality? What's important is you find someone who suits you. Are you telling me you don't look for qualities you're attracted to in a woman?" Anthony was silent. Finally, he said, "Maybe I've been overthinking this." Charles shook his head in amusement. "Anyway, we don't have time to talk about love," he said. Anthony agreed with him, but inside he still felt insecure. He wanted a loving relationship with someone, but he felt that it was impossible considering the era he was living in. The post-apocalyptic world was not a kind one. Many people had started to try and find enjoyment and let go of any regrets they had obtained from doing what they had to in the name of survival. Those who fared the best knew that it was because they couldn't spend all their time living in the past. Once they reconciled their past actions in their minds, they usually managed to find a degree of peace within themselves. Some of them dared to hope that one day it might be different. They knew that experiencing true happiness was only possible if they had experienced pain. They longed to live a vigorous life and to have fun. It was the daily struggle of those who were still alive, and most of them had accepted that reality as the new way of life. Miranda looked at Anthony. He seemed to be deep in thought, and she hoped Charles's words had managed to get through to him. She and Anthony were close, and she knew that Charles wouldn't be impressed at her sudden interest in Anthony's love life. But she was pleased that Anthony seemed a little more at peace with the idea of pursuing a relationship with someone. For a second, she indulged in imagining what it might be like to be with Anthony. She knew she had to make the most of every day, since she spent most of her time risking her life. She thought she might as well seize the good moments where she could. Charles turned to Alice, who'd been quiet during his distribution of the new weapons. "I'm making something special for you," he said quietly, "but I haven't finished it yet. When it's ready, I think you'll be really pleased with it." Alice revealed a happy smile. "I can't wait," she said. Then Charles addressed everyone else. "Don't be unhappy," he said. "This equipment should be enough for now. I'll make the rest as soon as I can. But I want you all to know that even if I give you better equipment, you probably won't be able to use it yet. This material takes practice and considerable skill to handle." He wasn't kidding when he had said he hadn't had time to refine a weapon for each of them, but he saw little point in hurrying the process when the others wouldn't be able to wield them anyway. Giving them expert weapons was a waste of energy if they couldn't use them. Tommy and the others nodded, but none of them looked impressed with the decision. Tina, on the other hand, said, "Look, everyone, it takes Charles ages to make these things. It's a privilege to get them at all, and they're custom-made. Let's not complain about who got what and why. We've never worried about it before." Her words seemed to soften Tommy and Hugh. They both seemed slightly less surly. They had felt a little envious of Kevin, Elena, Zach, and Lena, but since they weren't as close to Charles, they had felt as though they couldn't say anything. But they knew Tina was right. Other people could only dream of getting the things they had. They were in a much better position than some other people, especially those who had suffered from energy loss. Because they had encountered many dangers during recent times, many people had suffered from energy loss when they had tried to increase their cultivation levels too quickly. None of Charles's most trusted followers had to worry about that possibility, because he always helped them with minor injuries. It was one of the best perks of being his longest-standing comrades. Charles seemed to notice Tommy and Hugh's disappointment. "I can use the same method I used to awaken Elena on you," he assured them, "but it requires your bodies and willpower to be strong enough to handle the changes. The process comes with risks. Tina is probably the closest of you to the required standard, but all of you still need to work hard." "Why did you change Elena before us?" Hugh asked softly. Elena had joined the Alliance after all of them, and yet Charles had made her a paranormal first. That fact had always annoyed the others. All of them knew Elena was talented, and they accepted that they didn't have her drive, but they still saw the move as unfair when they had done their due diligence. "There are a lot of members in the Dawn Alliance," Charles said. "That's why I never spent my time convincing anyone else to join, and focused all my energy on you guys, because you're all much further along than them. It's a process. The length of time it takes depends on you." Hugh and Tommy exchanged nervous looks when they heard Charles's explanation. They had followed him for a long time, and they knew him well. They had always been loyal to him, but they suddenly understood that loyalty would only get them so far. Unless Miranda or one of the others somehow convinced Charles to change them, they would need to put in considerable effort to become paranormals. Judging by what Charles had said, the amount of training they needed was significant, but he evidently thought they were capable. Otherwise, he wouldn't waste his energy on them. The thing that worried them both the most wasn't the perceived unfair treatment, but that they may not be useful to Charles anymore. Being of no value to him was a dangerous position to be in. "I won't be going out today," Charles said. "Alice and Zach, you two keep an eye on the protective shield. If it needs replenishing, delegate the other paranormals to top it up. The rest of you follow me. We're having a training day." The announcement made Hugh and Tommy's hearts sink. Hank, who had been silent the whole time, seemed oddly quiet. When they had lived at the fortress, Charles had run one of his training days before the arrival of the Hive Queen. Although it had been a short day and they had all improved exponentially, it had been exhausting. Charles noticed Hank's reluctance. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he told him. "No, I'll go," Hank said quickly. Charles nodded. "Tell the people who joined us before the swarm attack that I'm offering training today, and do your best. This is for your own benefit. If you don't want to lose your lives on the battlefield, then take it seriously." Hugh and the other two men nodded in unison. Charles had a bad feeling that Hank's heart wasn't in the cause anymore. He was tall and strong, and his physique was good, but he was a little lazy. He had initially applied minimal effort and had managed to create a gap between himself and the more inefficient fighters. Since then, though, Hank had enjoyed the same treatment as Hugh and the other two, but Charles had never seen him practice. He had learned a few of the ancient martial arts techniques, but he hadn't improved much overall. Not only that, but he used his position in the Alliance to hook up with multiple women. The only reason Charles hadn't said anything was because he didn't seem to be mistreating them in any way. But he had lost a great deal of respect for him, and he didn't take him seriously as an Alliance leader anymore. Hugh and the others were ambitious people, and Charles was willing to help them achieve their goals. But he was no longer willing to waste his time on Hank. If he was going to be lazy and shirk his training, he wasn't the kind of person Charles needed around. Charles turned his attention to Miranda. "The students you brought back last time," he said. "They're all good people. If any of them want to learn to defend themselves, then tell them they can come and train with us." He had been impressed with the youths. The students had been willing to risk their lives for Miranda, which demonstrated that they were loyal. Since they had obviously proven their loyalty to her, Charles didn't mind training them so that Miranda could have the support of a strong team. "That's a great idea," Miranda said. She hadn't been present for Charles's last training session, and she didn't see the identical looks of glee on Tommy and Hugh's faces. She was curious to see what Charles's training was like. When they arrived at the training grounds, Miranda asked Tina, "Is Charles's training really so grueling? Why does everyone seem so scared?" "This is no normal training," said Tina. "Charles's training is really something else." "We watched the Army train this way," said Hugh, nodding. "This won't be quite as tiring as that, but it's still an ordeal." Tommy had turned pale, as though he couldn't bear to face the memory of what he had seen before. "It's not just scary," he said. But whatever it was, he couldn't find the word for it. Now Miranda was even more curious. She knew that everybody with her had recently faced one life-or-death situation or another. They had all walked the same road, facing danger and confronting monsters, whether human, non-human, or superhuman. If they had managed to tough it out through all that, why did the prospect of Charles's training frighten them so much? And if it was so scary, why didn't they simply refuse it? Could it really be so useful that it was worth struggling through this anxiety? Her heart prickled with nerves. "I'm just here to see how he treats my students," she thought, relieved to have found an excuse for her curiosity. She followed the crowd to the main training grounds. Including Anthony, she brought 21 students. This was her core class. She looked forward to seeing how they would face this challenge. Apart from a few core members, Charles had had more than 200 people on his side when the bug horde had first attacked. That number had dropped slightly after some of them had died in battle, and the remaining people were led by Olivia and Tina into the training field. Charles had arranged the field with trenches and military bunkers to emulate the defenses they would be left with if an enemy force managed to break through the energy shield. Olivia also regularly trained Alliance members in this area, giving her students some experience with these defensive measures so that they could take the best advantage of them when the real fighting started. On arrival, the students were clearly disappointed. After all, they had used these training grounds often enough before. If Charles's personal training simply mimicked the classes they had already gone through, it would be a bit of a letdown. But their disappointment soon passed when they realized that they now made up the second ever batch of students that Charles had ever trained. This made them feel important, and seemed to put them on a level higher than the other Alliance members. The simple fact that he had gathered them at all showed them that he had not forgotten them, even if this was group training rather than one-on-one. When they arrived at the training grounds, though, they saw that Charles had also brought half of the Alliance's light-type paranormals, a group that was normally called on to heal severe injuries after battle. The paranormals stood to one side, next to Charles's spot on a raised plinth. The sight of them set many hearts in the crowd racing. What was Charles about to put them through? Would it be an actual battle? If not, why did they need so many healers present? Charles raised his hand, and silence fell. "We've already experienced more than one battle," he called out. "Certainly enough to know that in war, either we die or our enemy dies. There are two deciding factors. The first is our strength, and the second our courage. True courage is not a fleeting thing, but the determination to hold fast in the face of formidable enemies, our hands firmly gripped on our weapons." At these words, many in the crowd instinctively tightened their grip on their own weapons. They knew how difficult it was to remain calm in the face of an army thousands strong, but also knew the great value of holding onto that calm. The Neal family, for instance, had gathered an army of tens of thousands of people, but had been defeated by an alliance of only 1,000 people. History was full of armies that had experienced hundreds of battles, but had been completely wiped out due to a collapse in morale. And yet there had also been many instances where, with the correct strategy and determination, a few hundred people had destroyed a camp of tens of thousands. While it was impossible to face such odds with strength alone, it was another matter if you could strike fear in the heart of the enemy. Life or death situations give us the best training grounds we could hope for, Charles continued. If you survive enough of them, you'll become an expert on the field of battle. But it's important to remember that when we look on the victors of war, we only see their glories. We don't see the dangers they faced or the number of enemies they had to put under the ground. The crowd was transfixed, each person waiting on his every word. If these had been times of peace, his words wouldn't have resonated so deeply. But every person assembled there had direct experience of the things he spoke about. They understood how it felt to face death head-on, to suffer the grief of losing their loved ones. It was true that they could turn selfish and angry when their backs were up against the wall, but deep down, this behavior originated in their fear of facing death. Even Charles wasn't eager to go through the 10 years of darkness again. No matter how many battles they had gone through up to this point, the prospect of facing yet another always brought with it the question of whether they would be able to muster the courage this time too. One man in the crowd shouted, "Leader, let's start our training. We aren't afraid of anything." "That's right," called out another. "We can cope with whatever you throw at us. We'll take on anything. Better to test our nerves now so we don't lose them in the actual battle." The air was soon full of enthusiastic chatter. The trainees knew that some of them would walk away from the training injured, but they had the courage to face anything. They knew that whatever they faced now would only benefit them on the battlefield. Charles smiled. "Very good," he said, and he pointed behind them. "Since you clearly all have the courage to face your fears, your first challenge is to cross that wooden bridge to the tower on the other side." They turned to look in the direction he was pointing, where the ground rose a little higher before plunging into a deep pit. On the other side stood a tall tower. The only thing they couldn't see was the bridge. From one side of the pit to the other, they could see no way of crossing at all. The same question was on everyone's lips. Where's the bridge? They were confused, muttering among themselves as they wondered how they could possibly cross over the pit with no bridge. But then someone cried out, "There's the bridge! It's made of glass!" When the others looked more closely, they could just barely see it. There was indeed a bridge, rising high in the air over the pit, made of glass so perfectly polished that it was almost invisible. It was as narrow as a slender log, without even a guardrail. One of Miranda's students gasped. "It's so high off the ground," she said. "Are there really no safety measures at all?" The sight of the bridge rising so high above the ground turned her legs weak. "It's so narrow," said another student. "We'd have to go single file." "Is this to test our courage?" asked yet another. "It's more like a tightrope than a bridge." "Yeah, you need an acrobat to get across that thing." The group's previous determination turned once more to disappointment. They couldn't see how this training would benefit them at all. How could walking along such a narrow bridge really prepare them for the battlefield? Sure, it required courage, but not the same courage as needed to face an enemy army in battle. The exercise would help them to face their fear of heights. That was hardly the same as confronting their fear of death itself. Even if they were to cross the bridge without the slightest tremor or misstep, that wouldn't make it any easier to face the enemy's swords and gunfire. But it didn't matter. It was clear that this was only the first task of Charles's training. And even if they couldn't see its benefit as combat training, that didn't mean it was completely useless. "Your experience as martial artist has improved both your physical fitness and your coordination," said Charles. "But you also need to hone your mental focus. The problem isn't that you can't physically cross the bridge, it's that you don't believe that you can. Now step up." Hugh, Tina, and Tommy walked up to the edge of the pit. The crowd watched transfixed. They couldn't help but put themselves in the shoes of these first candidates, and they wondered if they would be able to make the crossing when it was their turn. "Do you think that martial artists are just a bit stronger and more skilled than regular people?" Charles asked. "Not so. A martial artist is much more powerful than the common person. If you're willing to test your body's limits, You too will be able to access that power. He turned to Tina and said, "Show them how it's done." Tina nodded and stepped up to the start of the bridge. Everyone in the crowd held their breath as they wondered if she could really make the crossing. The bridge was so narrow and the drop so deep that the slightest mistake was as likely as it was dangerous. To place one foot on it, let alone cross the whole thing, would take an enormous amount of courage. They were even more shocked then when she hardly hesitated before walking out onto the bridge. They had assumed that even if she did attempt to cross, she would do so slowly and carefully, the same as when you saw tightrope walkers, or the way that a thrilling action scene on TV is stretched out for every moment of tension. Instead, Tina walked across the bridge with the same speed and ease as if she was walking upon solid ground. For her, this was nothing. Although this was her first time attempting such a task, her previous training with Charles had shown her what she was capable of, if she only had the courage. Within moments, she had completed the crossing. "Tina's no different from any of you," Charles said to the crowd. "She is not a paranormal, but a martial artist who relies on her own strength to constantly push her limits. The reason she was able to do this isn't because she had trained and prepared. It's that she has courage and confidence in her own capabilities." Next, Hugh and Tommy crossed the bridge with the same ease and fearlessness. The members of the audience couldn't believe what they were seeing. Could it really be that this glass bridge was that easy to walk on? Miranda looked around the crowd and smiled. She understood that Charles was using this demonstration to develop the confidence of everybody assembled there. Before long, a young man in the crowd raised his hand and called out, "I'll try too." "Even if I fall," he thought, "I'm fit and strong enough that I'll be fine." He passed through the crowd, arrived at the bridge, and peered over the edge. When he looked down from above, he felt dizzy, and his legs became weak. He took a deep breath and gradually calmed down. Then, he took his first step. The glass was so smooth under his foot that he almost slipped. He staggered back, and the crowd gasped. But then he tried again, and since he knew what to expect, he found he was able to place his foot on the glass firmly. He realized that his time with the Alliance had not only increased his strength and speed, but his balance too. With this renewed confidence, he took another step, and then another. Gradually, his courage grew, and he walked faster and faster on the glass bridge until, before long, he had reached the other side. He turned back to find the audience watching him, stunned. It had been one thing for them to watch the more experienced Alliance members cross the bridge, and another for one of their own number to manage it. The young man called out, "Don't be afraid. It's much easier than it looks, but you need to have courage." Soon the members of the crowd were shouting out with enthusiasm, "I'll try it! Me too! Let me go first!" "Well, don't just talk about it. Hurry up and give it a shot!" With this new enthusiasm, they crossed the bridge one by one, stunned to discover that they had the endurance and coordination to reach the other side safely. They were still scared, but their bodies rose to the challenge and helped them over to the other side. "I made it!" one of them shouted. "I did it!" called out another. "I really did it!" "Piece of cake. Let's go on to the next task." "Yeah, we did this with no problem, so let's move on." Charles grinned to see the excitement on their faces, and even Miranda couldn't suppress a smile. The cultivation of a martial artist was a process of constantly meeting and surpassing the limits of the human body. The glass bridge would pose a formidable challenge to any ordinary person, but for martial artists, it was as simple as walking across a balance bar in a school gym. At first, the group had been afraid of falling from such a great height. When they stepped foot on the bridge, it seemed like their bodies sent a message to their brains, telling them that even if they fell, it wouldn't be such a big deal. And once they understood this, crossing the bridge was no different to walking along the ground. It no longer felt like a new, dangerous experience, any more than a stroll down the street was. But this new realization didn't hamper their excitement, and they enthusiastically rushed to the second training area. There, a second glass bridge spanned a pit that was even wider and deeper than the first. They could just make out something glittering on the floor of the pit. "What is it?" asked one of them. "It's shards of glass," gasped another. "Oh no, so if we fall..." "I can't even think about it. I have goosebumps all over my body. It had been one thing to cross over the first bridge, where they had only faced a slight drop. But with this one, the fall was much higher, with deadly glass at the bottom of it. Some members of the crowd were still buoyed by their enthusiasm. "It's just broken glass," said one. "We're strong enough that even if we fall, it shouldn't be too bad." "And who's to say we're going to fall?" asked Oliver. "As long as we focus on staying on the bridge, it doesn't matter what's at the bottom of the pit." Once again, to build everybody's confidence, Charles began by calling on the more experienced members of the Alliance. "Tina, you're up first," he said. Tina, who had crossed the first bridge so effortlessly, was visibly nervous as she approached this one. This confused the crowd, putting them on edge. She took a deep breath. Then, with great care, she began to cross. She hadn't taken more than a few steps before Charles pulled out a gun. The crowd gasped. What's he thinking? Could he really be about to? He's going to shoot! Charles walked to the edge of the pit and shot at Tina. The bullet whistled past her face, almost grazing her cheek, but her expression didn't change. It was as if she hadn't even heard the shot, let alone felt the bullet. Charles kept firing, the bullets whipping past her, but never quite making contact. "How's she staying so calm?" asked one woman in the crowd. At one point, a bullet shot at the point where her head had been just a moment before. If she'd been moving even slightly slower, she would have been killed in an instant. The crowd was outraged. "This isn't training," another woman cried out. "He's going to kill her." "He's ruthless," a man shouted. "I can't look." Next, Charles holstered his gun and pulled out a set of throwing knives. Then he flung them at Tina one by one. They arced through the air, soaring right at her until, just at the last moment, she leaped off the bridge. The people in the crowd cried out, but then they heaved a sigh of relief, spotting that she hadn't fallen into the glass, but had caught the edge of the pit. She used her great strength to leap up onto solid ground. The crowd cheered, bursting into applause. "Amazing! You're the best, Tina!" Not only were they impressed by Tina's skills, but they also began to wonder if they too would manage a similar feat. "Are we up next?" one woman asked. "My legs have gone weak," said another. "What if I can't dodge the bullet?" "Don't worry," said one woman. "Remember that the last training looked impossible too, before we tried it. This could be just the same." "Your training won't be the same," said Charles. "I don't expect you to dodge bullets." Everyone in the crowd sighed in unison. But then Charles went on. "For this task, 2 people will try to cross the bridge at the same time, one from either end. Only one will make it to the other side. The other will go down." "What did he just say?" asked an Alliance member. "I must have heard him wrong." "That means at least half of us will fall into the glass." "This is too cruel. Give me bullets any day of the week." "If you want to quit training," Charles carried on, "you're more than welcome to leave. I won't force anyone to participate. But remember that when it comes to the heat of battle, you don't get to choose between fighting and not fighting. You simply do what's required." The crowd fell deadly silent. "But I can give you this one promise," said Charles. "Each of you who wins 100 matches on the bridge will be rewarded with a special set of armor that can block ordinary bullets. It doesn't matter how many times you lose, as long as you get back up and eventually win 100 times. What's more, the first 3 people to win 100 rounds will be given a special ammunition that can block other bullets mid-flight." The people in the crowd were won over. They had known all along that Charles's equipment was of a high quality, but now that they knew it had been refined by his paranormals, they understood that it was on a completely different level. The prospect of the trainees possessing some of this equipment for themselves was exciting, and had the exact effect that Charles had intended. "I want to train. Let me fight." "Me too. I'm going to win that armor." "Forget the armor. I'm getting the bullets." It wasn't enough to motivate people by reminding them of just how much courage they would need in the face of battle. They also needed to be motivated to work together. Even though everybody knew that they would need to face the enemy sooner or later, many of them were more concerned with having fun than improving their martial arts skills. It seemed to them that even working hard was no guarantee that they would survive in battle, so they might as well at least enjoy themselves while they had the chance. Charles wanted to change this mentality, so he had given them the chance to improve themselves on the bridges. The refined equipment he had promised as a prize wouldn't be enough to turn the tide of an actual battle, but it would greatly increase their chances of survival. And so, in offering the armor as a prize, the second task was no longer simply a test of who won on this occasion, but a deciding factor in who might survive any battles down the line. With such a precious prize, everyone was eager to take part. Next, Charles announced the rules of engagement. "There are no weapons allowed," he said. "Everyone will be given a number plate to record their victories. There are 3 bridges. The winner of a match can stay to fight one more round, but then they must give up their spot. This way, everyone will get a turn." They were excited to start the matches. Because only the first 3 who won more than 100 times would be rewarded with the special bullets, they were keen to follow the rules to the letter. The first 2 fighters were called up, and each took one end of the bridge. The first was a young city type, while the second was a middle-aged man who looked like he might be a farmer. This was the same man who had shouted at the people who had threatened to leave the Dawn Alliance. The audience was excited to see who would win, each of them aware of the dangers if one should make even the slightest mistake. "Let the battle begin," shouted Charles. The young man made the first move, throwing a punch at the older man. The farmer dodged to the side and used his opening to push the young man. If they'd been fighting on solid ground, the push wouldn't have had any effect. But because the glass was so smooth, the young man lost his balance and toppled from the bridge. "What?" said one of the audience members. "If it's that simple to shove someone off, this will be easy as anything." But just as it seemed that the battle had been decided, the young man grabbed the farmer's ankle on his way down, pulling him off the bridge too. Many in the audience covered their eyes as the 2 men fell into the deep pit with a sickening crunch. "Healers," Oliver called to the nearby paranormals. "Get ready to heal their wounds." The audience waited in stunned silence to see what would happen next. Within a few moments, both men crawled out of the pit. "How horrible," somebody called out. "They both fell, so who won?" They were surprised to find that although the young man had torn his clothes, he didn't have any injuries. The middle-aged man, though, had several cuts to his face and large patches of blood on his shirt. The crowd could even make out shards of glass sticking out from some of his cuts. He shuffled out of the pit, groaning, and asked Charles to treat his wounds. Charles nodded to the paranormals to heal the man, and then he turned back to the crowd. "Our physical fitness has improved," he said, "but there's a big difference between defending ourselves with our physical strength and using our soul energy for protection. If we invoke our soul energy in time, we can withstand even the greatest of injuries." The crowd realized how the young man had escaped the fall unscathed. He'd used his soul energy to protect himself. "But hang on," a woman called out. "How can we be expected to remember to activate our soul energy when we're falling from the sky?" At that time, the greatest martial artists among them were at the peak of the 2nd level, while more than half were still stuck at the 1st level. Their limited energies would make it impossible to keep their spiritual defenses up at all times. And yet they were expected to win not 1, but 100 battles total. If they spent all their energy protecting their bodies, they wouldn't have any left over for the actual fighting. "And you didn't answer the first question," called out a man. "Who won just now? Was it a draw?" "They both lost," Charles announced. "So a draw of sorts," a woman said unhappily. "On the battlefield you fight to the death," said Charles. "You have only 1 life. If you lose it, what's the point in aiming for a draw?" A hush fell over the crowd. "This test is just a practice battle," he continued. "As long as everyone is careful of the angle of the fall and how they hit the ground, the damage won't be too great. But what if we were fighting on the actual battlefield? Do you really think we'd have the chance to prepare and to try all over again if we lost? If you want to keep living, you have to win every time. A moment's carelessness could cost you everything. Don't let your enemy drag you down with them. Only the strongest will succeed, and their reward will be living to fight another day." The speech filled the hearts of the crowd with hope. They repeated his words in their heads. Only the strongest will succeed, and their reward will be living to fight another day. With this statement, They weren't being threatened with death, but tempted with life. And it showed that the reason he wanted them to be strong wasn't that they would win battles for him, but simply that they would survive. It gave them the feeling that they weren't fighting for him or under him. Rather, they were fighting with him. They adored him more than ever. Their great leader, who had the courage to stand at the head of all of them, who was doing all he could to keep them alive. They knew now that he was worthy of all their support and loyalty, and with this knowledge, they were determined to do all they could to prove themselves in front of him. "Let's do it!" one of them called out. "Only the strongest will succeed!" The fighting on the glass bridges was in full swing, with all contestants highly motivated to win. With the stakes so high, it was difficult to remain calm. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, though, because keeping perfectly calm wouldn't necessarily help anybody keep their courage up. To win the competition, though, it was vital to remain brave, while also keeping a calm enough mind to hone courage and strength. Otherwise, they might easily be dragged down with their enemy, even if they thought they had triumphed, just as the young man had done to the farmer. In fact, well over half of the battles ended in this kind of draw. In Charles's eyes, this was the same as a defeat. Only those who remained on the bridge would be counted winners. Some of those still watching from the sidelines weren't shy to express their disdain. "Who cares who wins here?" asked one of them. "Things are a lot more complicated on the battlefield. This is no preparation for actual combat." "Even if I win 100 battles on this stupid bridge," chimed in another, "how will that help me survive against an enemy that actually wants to kill me?" "Yeah, true victory relies on strength," said yet another. "All this game test is your balance." These people were in the minority and were shunned by the rest of the audience. These sorts of comments didn't necessarily mean that they had a bad character. After all, it was natural to be envious of others. But they showed that these people hadn't really understood Charles's message and weren't fully serious about their survival. Their argument was that, because no amount of practice will prepare you for the actual battlefield, there was no point in training at all. If this attitude spread through the entire alliance, it would spell disaster. And so anybody with any sense did their best to separate themselves from such people. As a result, the alliance divided between those committed to bettering themselves and those who didn't see the point, as working hard gave you no guarantee that your chance of survival would be any higher. Their arguing gave Olivia such a headache that she wouldn't sleep well for the next few days. Meanwhile, the fighting went on. Charles watched from the sidelines, taking note of the members he found particularly impressive. But because they were all new to this style of fighting, it wasn't easy to predict who would manage to win 100 battles. Many found the process so difficult and traumatic that they chose to quit. Charles didn't pass any comment on these people. Their decision was their own. All he could provide them with was a means to improve themselves. He couldn't force them to make use of it. Instead, he carried on observing the fighting, waiting for a truly outstanding warrior to reveal themselves. After a while, he left Miranda to supervise the fighting and took Alice, Elena, and Lena out of the survival base, leaving Sylvia in charge of watching over Jenny. Although it was difficult for Jenny to move, her strength was growing. After leaving the survival base, the four of them ran north. Charles was able to run at the speed of a professional athlete, and he asked the others to try to keep up with him. Although it was a challenge, because Paranormal's physiques were much stronger than those of ordinary people, they were just about able to keep up. Alice complained all the way, but Charles didn't have the slightest intention of slowing down. Likewise, when Lena said that she wanted to rest for a while, Charles encouraged her that it was important they stick together. At that time, Charles was practically deified among the Alliance members, and he was sometimes so focused on the Alliance at large that he lost sight of the needs of those closest to him. Lena didn't want to be a burden to her brother. More than anything, she wanted to prove herself as a useful person in her own right. Although she had done a lot to help during Charles's coma, she didn't feel that it was enough. She didn't want to fight under the protection of others. Rather, she wanted to be the one protecting others. For the time being, she felt she could only watch her brother fight from the sidelines. She didn't want to see him hurt a second time. In turn, Charles didn't want his sister to take on too much risk. After running at top speed for more than half an hour, they finally stopped at the edge of a great river. The Alliance's original location had been close to the river, so naturally, water had been easier to access and so more affordable. Lena was puzzled. "Why did you bring us here?" she asked. "To practice archery?" She remembered Charles's previous archery lessons. Did he bring me here to practice shooting the fish in the river? She wondered. That'll be way too tricky. Charles nodded. "That's right," he said. "This is a great practice spot." He took a blue ball from his pocket and handed it to Alice. "I prepared this special item for you. We need to keep it secret, so I couldn't take it out in front of everyone." "How do you use it?" asked Alice, turning it over in her hands. "Do you hit people with it? Or does it increase water or ice powers?" Charles smiled. "It has one very simple function," he said. "It can store water. A lot of water."